Greetings, and let me first thank Professor Chandra Muzaffar, who is such an important international voice. It's an honor to be here at the Rhodes Forum. Peace and security in Europe and Asia, or in Africa, or in the US. It's the one thing that we cannot expect in the period ahead. It's war, instability, brutal austerity ahead for us. And that's because the largest capitalist state, the US economy, is in crisis and decline. The US economy has lost its dominant position in trade, production, technology, investment, and markets. Only its undisputed military position remains, and what could be more dangerous? The problem of the US as a global empire are systemic and incurable. They're based on the crisis of the capitalist system itself, which is chaotic, unstable, and at a dead end. The present crisis is far more serious than the cyclical crises of the past. Now, what I'd like to discuss in my 20 minutes is the following. It's a capitalist economic crisis that's driving the US empire's adventures around the world and its attack on the working class inside the US. And I want to discuss its impact, specifically in West Asia, here in Greece, in Ukraine, and on the workers in the United States, and show that while US militarism is very dangerous to the world, it has been unsuccessful in securing victories for the US ruling class. And I also want to stress that the best way to combat US militarism is to build solidarity among the peoples and more consciously link the many divergent struggles and movements, the political movements. Now, technology today is so massively productive that each cyclical startup almost immediately leads to a glut of overproduction. So only a massive bailout of the banks with federal funds squeezed from every social program, along with speculative bubbles and new wars, only those things provide a short uptick that keeps the US economy lurching along. In this period, US militarism is totally interwoven with the state itself. The enormous Pentagon budget has been used for decades to prop up and protect the largest, the dominant US industries, the military and oil corporations. And in a desperate effort to avoid economic collapse, the US empire is thrashing about, it's setting in motion forces that it can't control politically or militarily. And that is a crisis. And this is true whether we look at the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or the reckless expansion of NATO to the very borders of Russia, and the use of NATO in West Asia, or if we consider the fascist coup in the Ukraine against an elected government, or the military coup in Egypt against an elected government, or the Asia pivot, which is the US encirclement of China, pulling in Philippines and Korea and Japan, or the US-supported Israeli onslaught against Gaza. It has been one world crisis after another, and these crises are escalating. They're based on a strategy of divide and destabilize to rule. There's no rational plan to maintain US global domination, but there is a huge military apparatus of competing command centers, numerous intelligence networks contending for position. They're driven to sow division, racism, and fear, and to increase repression at every level, That's the only way they have of holding this decaying system together. And I very much agree with the previous speaker. It is certainly a war on the Muslim world, using all the racism and fear that go with that. The overriding danger is that as the U.S. empire loses its grip and loses its ability to control events, it may risk everything in a mad adventure to recoup its past position. That's a real danger. Despite trillions of dollars spent in massive destruction, Wall Street hasn't achieved its goals in the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Ukraine. The setbacks to its plans for complete dominance lead to even more dangerous adventures. The erratic U.S. demands on every country to participate in destabilizing economic sanctions on Iran, and now in growing intensity on Russia, are helping to fuel an interest in developing new economic blocks of trade and finance. And the BRICS today is more than a growing trade bloc among 5 emerging powerhouses. It's one of the clearest examples of the slip in U.S. hegemony, and it is a protective umbrella for many developing countries. Now, I want to turn my attention to another. This conference is taking place in Greece. And if we want to grasp how U.S. militarism can loot a whole economy and destroy the lives of millions, then Greece today is the world's best example. The term austerity takes its most brutal form right here, where pensions were slashed 40 and 60%. Youth unemployment is the highest in Europe, 57%. Unemployment is more than double general unemployment to more than 20%. Hospitals closed, health programs lack the most basic supplies. Now, Greece has been Europe's main military spender in relative terms for most of the past 40 years. The United States is by far the world's biggest arms exporter, and it aggressively uses its economic and especially its military position to impose massive and bankrupting weapons purchases on its allies and on dependent client states. Greece, with fewer than 11 million people from 2002 to 2006, was the world's 4th largest importer of armaments. 4th largest, imagine that, in the world. As a proportion of its GDP, Greece defense spending is nearly double that of any other EU member. Yet the people of Greece were told that the problem was that the people had lived beyond their means, that the workers were paid too much, that there were too many social programs, that the pensions were too generous, and now the bankers had to be paid. Who were the bankers? Greece would have no debt at all without decades of massive military spending. And it turns out that the United States and Germany were the largest Greek arms suppliers, and they were the 2 biggest proponents of austerity and the main creditors of the IMF austerity budget plans. When Greece couldn't pay its loans, they refused to allow this country to cancel or postpone its military contracts or to cut military spending. The only option that Greece was given was to honor its weapons contracts and slash every one of the social programs to the bone. Now, think about Wales and the meeting of NATO. The continuing U.S. demand made was that every NATO member spend 2% of its GDP on the military. Of course, that's a huge gift to U.S. and German military industries, isn't it? Now, I also want to address peace and security within the United States today, because in the U.S., we feel the impact of this monstrous military expenditure in every city. And ever since the economic crisis of 2008, the urban deterioration cannot be hidden. Only the military budget grows. It's more than half of the federal published budget. There's billions hidden in other hidden expenses. The growth of the military budget every year, and under Obama, it's the highest since World War II. Every year. It means cuts of 10% a year in federal funds to states and cities in order to balance a budget. This bankrupts city and state budgets. It means demands to cut pensions, city services, fire departments, parks, schools. Nothing is more destructive to peace and security than what is going on right now. The city of Detroit, previously the automobile, the motor city, it's a frightening example. Detroit was a city with the largest black home ownership, and it's lost more than a third of its population. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their homes because the banks simply refused to refinance home mortgages because the city was in crisis. Economic shock therapy is racist, and it's ruthless. Austerity is imposed by unelected officials who are appointed by the largest banks. And the attacks go much deeper. For late payment of water bills, 3,000 people a week in Detroit were having their water shut off. These cuts in water are predicted to leave 300,000 people without plumbing, without flush toilets or running water. It's a step in privatizing the city water system. Entire cities in what's now called the Rust Belt are being gutted of industries, millions of homes are being foreclosed, essential services are cut without notice and without appeal. The gap between the super rich 1% and the great majority of the population is greater than at any time in human history. Now, in New York City, where I live, city with the highest rents, it's home to Wall Street, to major banks and corporate offices, to center of art and culture, and yet 20% of the population live below the poverty line. 30% of families with children rely on food pantries, soup kitchens, free food programs, charity programs in order to eat. This past year, the federal government, the central government, cut funding to New York City food pantries and soup kitchens by 40%. And the same cuts were imposed on cities across the United States. The battle in the United States is increasingly between this ever-growing military budget and the trillions given to bail out the banks and the drastically shrinking funds of every other social program. Corporate power in the U.S. knows that this bankruptcy of every city will arouse resistance. And what is their response? It's to criminalize the youth. The largest prison population in the world now exists in the United States. It's 5 to 10 times the size of any other country. 1 in 3 black men will be in prison in their lifetime. The figures are harrowing, terrifying. The police shooting of another African-American youth in Ferguson, Missouri last month, it brought days of demonstrations, and it exposed to the world the militarization of police forces inside the United States today. Even the smallest U.S. cities, Ferguson is a city of 20,000 people, is equipped with tanks and armored personnel carriers and night goggles and new weapons. Incredibly, while teaching staffs in schools across the United States are being cut, school police departments, that is police departments that exist inside the schools, are getting free military equipment. So it means that the school police now have machine guns, grenade launchers, armored vehicles. Amazing, isn't it? Certainly an issue of peace and security. And it means, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, the wars do come home. Now, the NATO meeting, just this past month, it reopened with a U.S. charge of a Russian invasion of the Ukraine and a demand that every country join in harsher sanctions on Russia. President Obama claimed Russia's combat forces with Russian weapons and Russian tanks had crossed into the Ukraine. And NATO backed up Obama's statements. It said it had satellite images that claimed to show Russian combat forces engaged in military operations in the sovereign territory of the Ukraine. Then, actually a usually compliant group, observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, their special monitoring mission, released a public statement saying that they had registered no troops, no ammunition, no weapons crossing the Russian-Ukrainian border over the past 2 weeks. That was quite a prick in the balloon, wasn't it? It was a stunning expose. But the new EU sanctions on Russia are at odds with beneficial trade agreements in the market-driven economies within the European Union. And this creates a crisis for Europe. And it may well be why the EU jumped at Putin's ceasefire proposals. Now, what's the real reason for these sanctions and these manufactured crises, one after the other? Wall Street is actually desperate to tie the major European powers closer to U.S. needs, closer to Wall Street. That's what's behind demanding that all 28 members, East and West, expand their military expenditures to 2% of the GNP. In the same week as the NATO meeting, there were the 5+1 negotiations with Iran continuing on Iran's right to develop nuclear energy, a right guaranteed by international conventions. And suddenly, in the midst of these negotiations, the United States announced that they had increased the sanctions to 25 additional Iranian oil and banking corporations, right in the middle of negotiations. Sanctions are war, and that should be recognized. War on the most defenseless. It impacts the civilian population. That's who it's calculated to attack. Now, incredibly, during the same meeting of NATO in Wales, the United States was trying to push through NATO support for a new war in Iraq and in Syria. Didn't quite succeed. President Obama had to settle for a new form of the Bush coalition of the willing to sign on for a new war in the region. It's a war to divide, re-divide, re-re-divide, and subjugate. The war on ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, is a pretext to resume war and, most dangerously, to assert a new and most dangerous, a bombing of Syria. So here in one NATO meeting is the Ukraine, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and new arms sales all demanded. The decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the bombing of Libya, were massively destructive efforts to gain decisive control of oil and resource markets, but they failed totally in their original plan. But they did succeed in dividing the population socially, culturally, along the most destructive sectarian lines. U.S. policy has reinforced the most reactionary, sectarian, divisive, repressive regimes on the planet. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, absolute monarchies. Now, I just want to break and touch for a minute on climate change. We're just meetings at the, if we're discussing peace and security, we should focus on the global threat of climate change, which brings with it floods, famines, droughts, daily insecurity for millions. Now, who's the largest polluter on the planet today? The Pentagon. The U.S. military machine is considered the largest user of petroleum products on Earth, by far. And yet, by U.S. demand, since the Kyoto Conference in 1998, all U.S. military operations worldwide and within the U.S. are exempt from measurement or agreement or reduction on greenhouse gas emissions calculations. This is an issue that the environmental movement worldwide must address. U.S. wars and bombing and jet fuel and aircraft carriers and 1,000 U.S. bases around the world and NATO operations are all exempt from carbon calculations. The more we link the movements against endless war and the giant subsidies to the military and link it to the fight against the deadly cuts in social services, the more we make links to the global movements, the movements become stronger and they can survive. Now, in ending, in terms of lessons, personally, I'm not based in a university. I come as a grassroots activist movement, and I deeply feel that fundamental change comes from below, from making clear demands without illusions. In the United States, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, the policies are set by Wall Street and the Pentagon's drive for world dominance. It's not just bad policies or bad advisors, it's a system that is driven to make war. And the deteriorating positions, the U.S. deteriorating position exacerbates this drive to war. It's important to dispel illusions that U.S. policy pronouncements, and it's important to dispel the hope that a change in administration will mean any fundamental change. It won't. President Obama was elected on a peace platform and optimistically awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And yet, what's it meant in terms of U.S. policy? An 8-fold increase in drone attacks, special forces operations in 134 countries, twice as many as even under Bush. We could go on about the total disregard for international law, for the UN Charter, for the U.S. Constitution. It is international lawlessness. Now, concluding, is the future only doom and gloom? Today's corporate powers no longer live in a time where they alone have access to or an understanding of technology. Resistance can take new and surprising forms and can connect instantaneously around the world. Of course, the 1%, they use the military technology to reinforce the image that they're all powerful and beyond question. But the old order is being challenged on many levels, and we should consciously act to reinforce that resistance and do so in a way that emphasizes their vulnerability. Now, take the international solidarity movement with Palestine, just one example. The international grassroots activism on this issue played a vital role, whether it was mass demonstrations, demands for war crimes prosecution, blocking of ports and shipments, or supporting the boycott, divest, sanctions movement. Every U.S.-supplied Israeli bomb, the ever-present drones, the all-pervasive surveillance is meant to send this message of dominance. But the thousands of tunnels and homemade rockets, the thousands of weapons smuggled in under the most difficult conditions, expose that U.S. and Israeli technology is not all-seeing and it's not all-powerful. Gaza was a victory for armed resistance under the most difficult conditions imaginable. This resistance over decades, it has rich lessons in exposing the limits of U.S.-supported Israeli power. The destruction in Gaza was horrendous. A third of the housing destroyed, along with the electric grid, water pumping. But Israel failed to divide and disarm the Palestinian resistance. And that resistance confirms that people's movements are an emerging power. The unpredictable character of this dying system makes solidarity, class consciousness more important than at any time in human history. People's resistance in the Ukraine put a halt to the US-supported fascist coup and what seemed an inevitable expansion of NATO. It's crucial to acknowledge that it was resistance in cities across East Ukraine by local activists who seized and held government buildings for months, who set up roadblocks, who armed themselves, who organized a massive referendum and an orderly evacuation of children and many seniors. That was done by local people's movements in Donetsk, Lugansk. It wasn't Russian tanks, it was people's power. And it's good that that Ukrainian resistance has Russia at its back. That's important. But it was an organized demand for autonomy, for federation, and it's a real challenge. This organized people's movement has sprung up in response to enormous US funding and support for a fascist threat, and it changed the calculation. Suddenly, NATO and the Ukrainian oligarchs didn't look so all-powerful. For the first time in 20 years, NATO expansion was halted, was put on pause. So, as a final point, we're opposed to US imperialism, to our own ruling class, because it's the enemy of humanity. It's a concentration of capitalist exploitation, and it has nothing progressive to offer humanity. We can look at the past wars and their inability to rebuild Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya after the destruction. It's because it's an impossible task. A war machine is based on profit, and it's only capable of destruction. And it naturally aligns with the most reactionary and corrupt forces. Is there any framework to tie together an understanding of so many different struggles and movements? Unity and solidarity can become a material force of resistance, and we desperately need to build movements that take sides in this struggle. We can't be neutral observers. This is an anchor. Otherwise, every new propaganda barrage would knock us over, and that's its purpose, to overwhelm us with things that we already know in our bones. We need to build a unified movement that stands with the most oppressed in the United States and stands with oppressed countries around the world, that has an understanding of national oppression, can make an enormous contribution to building solidarity. And we also need movements that oppose the racism that exists in the US and the racist demonization of leaders around the world. When we make links to the struggle against war and the movement against austerity, this is my last line. When we link the movement against war with a movement against repression and massive imprisonment and incarceration, when we link the movement against war with a movement against climate change and build movements that refuse to be caught up in a propaganda barrage, then we assert again that the people united will not be defeated. Thank you.